Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tanks with CS finally. It's been a while, so I appreciate that you stick around, so to speak. It's good to have you back. So today's video will be a bit of an exploration of two tanks that have been introduced relatively recently into the game. The tanks are Object 430 and Object 430U, Soviet mediums at tier 9 and tier 10. I guess these tanks are of interest or intrigue for myself as well as probably quite a few people in the player base because to be honest, they're fairly strong tanks. Technically, these two tanks are not exactly medium tanks, so to speak, even though they're classified as such in game. In real life, these two tanks are actually both prototypes for the first generation T-64 main battle tanks the Soviet had in the 60s. And arguably, these two tanks are essentially two variants of the same design concept or the same design program. So, on technical terms, more than anything, these two tanks are probably by the book main battle tanks rather than medium tanks. So you might ask, what is a main battle tank? What makes a main battle tank a main battle tank? I would say one way to look at it would be, main battle tanks are essentially modern tanks or relatively contemporary tanks that exhibit relatively powerful and balanced traits regarding this trinity of firepower, protection, and mobility. Because traditionally, medium tanks tends to be moderately mobile, moderately well armored, and have moderate firepower. Heavy tanks tends to have a good armor, good survivability, pretty good firepower with some kind of drawbacks in terms of practicality. They might be clumsy, they might be unreliable, they might be maintenance intensive, they might be expensive, and then of course, heavy tanks are slow. Meanwhile, traditionally, light tanks tend to have fairly minimal armor, minimal to mediocre firepower, and good mobility. So, in general, main battle tanks that have been introduced since the 60s, and that's pretty much in service even to this day, are essentially powerful and all-around versatile vehicles. So you might ask, how does that translate in game? Honestly, I would say that the performance of these tanks, as showcased in my gameplay, speaks loudly of their capabilities and what they can do. That is, they are fast, definitely on the fast side of things. They're durable, without a question, on the durable side of things, and they have no problem hurting whatever they might run into at all. So they're not gimped or vulnerable or weak in any given way. Sure, consider Wargaming's recent record of introducing progressively more fictional and overpowered and questionable vehicles, like the 268-4 or the upcoming Polish heavy. Perhaps the performance for the 430 and 430U are already considered to be good without being exceptional or fantastic. But nonetheless, these tanks represent a giant leap forward versus, how tanks of their given tier were like, even just 2 years back in game, so to speak. If you want to go into the specifics, I would say that if you want to look at the numbers, obviously, the 430 is as fast as any high-tier Russian medium, which means you can do 55 kilometers an hour in a straight line. It has pretty good power-to-weight ratio. It has pretty good ground resistance, so it doesn't get bogged down. It, for the most part, turns on a dime, and it's definitely on the faster side of things regarding mediums. Even though of course, there's going to be tanks like the Leopard or the French tanks that's going to be faster, but then those tanks might as well have less armor than a car, right? I, you know, this tank essentially has a Russian-style soup bowl-shaped turret that has at least 250mm of armor, arguably more in places. Relatively small, hard to hit weak spots, and obviously ample angling. So the reality is that even though you might have 250mm of armor, if you factor in the angling, you really effectively have about 300 or so. So essentially, you will take gold spam and good aiming and good RNG from a tier 9 or tier 10 to actually go through your turret. The hull for the 430 is also pretty solid. It would have been spectacular if we were talking about how things were back in 2015 and 2014. That is, it's got very slanted upper glacis and lower glacis, without a lower glacis weak spot or any notable hatch or visor or cupola weak spot on the hull. And the hull is pretty much 120mm. So in practice, that means the hull for this tank will reliably bounce up to 220, 230mm pan guns. So that means up to tier 9s without gold spam, your armor is relatively reliable. And in terms of firepower, this tank also hits really hard. I mean, sure, it's not really the most reliable sniper tank. The gun doesn't have minimal bloom or good handling at distance, but it has no problem dealing with enemies at all, at medium range or normal combat range. It's got essentially 20-25mm of penetration and 390 alpha, with a relatively decent mid 8-second reload. So in terms of penetration, it's definitely a step up from the traditional T-54. In terms of alpha, it's definitely a step up from and most of the 90mm or 100mm or even some of the 105mm armed tanks of its tier and type. So the firepower is good. I will say that probably more than anything, the 430 and 430U in a way represent arguably the finest of what heavy medium tanks are. Ironically, that's also one way to describe how mean battle tanks are, because they essentially have a heavy's protection scheme and firepower, along with a medium's mobility, arguably even a light tank's mobility, and of course camo and such, which is semi-hidden in World of Tanks, but quite a big deal. It depends on how you play. So today's second replay is on Ruinberg. This replay doesn't come from the very beginning of my ownership of this tank, so to speak. As in, my ownership of the current variant of this tank, considering the tank had been in-game as a tier 10 medium previously. Obviously, in that case, we play very differently, but that's what it is. Ruinberg is one of those interesting maps in which mobility and armor both counts a lot, because it's got multiple important choke points that if you take possession of them relatively quickly, you can quickly gain control of certain key flanks and corridors in the map. So that means you have to reach there relatively quickly. Sure, you might be driving a Japanese heavy like a Type 5 or a German slow heavy like the Mouse, and your armor's good. Obviously when your armor's good and you make some use of hardcover, you become powerful, if not already invincible. But then once again, if you don't have the flexibility and mobility and maneuverability to be at the right place at the right time, let's just say that the right place at the wrong time doesn't quite work. And so as you can see now, I have essentially taking over the middle corridor on Ruinberg. So pretty much any enemy on their side of the field trying to push into the eastern flank of the map will more or less expose their flank to me. And obviously, if you got a flanking shot in, you're dealing with enemy side armor, which is obviously thinner, and you can go through relatively more easily. Of course, you can also track the enemies as they can move, and you'll sit in the open and become vulnerable to focus fire, so to speak. Another way to look at this tank will be, this tank in a sense, it's kind of like a Russian WZ-120 Chinese Tier 9 medium tank. Because, both of them are medium tanks with relatively high alpha strikes, good turret armor, and relatively good hull armor. Even though, in a sense, the 430 with, its orbital bound shoulders and 20mm of extra armor on the hull, in a sense, power creeped 120. I mean, sure, the 120 has 440 alpha, which is 50 more than what the 430 has, and also the 120 effectively has about 250mm repent, as he shares the same gun as the 113, which is the Tier 10 heavy. The 430 does have certain advantages over the 120. First and foremost, the 430 it's a lower profile tank, so it's harder to be hit. The 430 does have 2 degrees more depression, which is 5 degrees, versus the 120's 3 degrees. So that means, with 5 degrees depression, you can often make use of common terrain features and ground cover as hard cover for your own protection. Arguably, the 120 will struggle in this kind of situation. And of course, as I said before, the 120 has, just an outright inferior hull. Arguably, probably the fuel tank and ammo rack, which is a signature of Chinese medium tanks. So you can also argue that the 430 is about as mobile, gives up some alpha and PAM, but for much better soft stats when it comes to its firepower, and is notably better when it comes to survivability. Which, ultimately is not so surprising, because if you are, a history buff or tank buff, you can see that the 120, which is, Type 59, is essentially a variant of 455 series of tanks. Meanwhile, the 430, although not a bona fide T-64, is a prototype of the T-64. So, it's about half a generation ahead of, the Chinese tank, so to speak. I would say, perhaps a little unfortunate thing about this tank is the fact that, even though, essentially physically the same tank got down-tiered, it's given a different gun, which is the 122mm versus, the 120, the 100mm we had back in the day, it's a Tier 10. I'm kind of disappointed about the fact that the old version of the tank no longer exists. Which ironically, I would say that the old version of the tank is probably closer to how this tank really was historically. As in very low profile, very agile, and relatively light medium tank / proto main bottle tank. It's only used 100mm gun. Because ultimately, if anything, the Tier 10 version of this tank is really the true variant that really exhibits an experimental attempt to outgun medium tanks up to heavy tank level. Because the reality is that, the 430 in real life only carried 100mm, and it wasn't really upgraded to a larger caliber weapon until the 150mm smooth bore the Russians had on the 432. Which obviously quickly got turned into the T-64 after modifications. But I digress. There's always a lot of information. So the last replay for today's video essentially come from before the latest patch of tanks hit. So it still features the old school graphics. Obviously, if you're nostalgic or if you want to see how tanks used to be like, here it is. I do have many replays of the older version of the game. Perhaps I can, put them up eventually. So anyways, what is the 430U? The 430U is essentially a experimental variant of the 430 project, or much rather, obviously a prototype for the T-64 mean bottle tank project. A key principle behind this tank's design is to essentially try to experiment and see how much armor or how much firepower you can ultimately relatively conveniently pack into the hull and dimension and I guess the technical platform of medium tank. Because obviously in the 50s, or much rather essentially in the first decade of the Cold War, the Soviet had both their medium tanks, which is T-54, T-55 series, coming from the T-44, and obviously earlier the famous T-34 series. Meanwhile, their heavy tanks were also fairly famous, the T-10, and obviously many experimental designs coming out of the IS lines. But they essentially have gotten to a point in which they realize perhaps the medium tanks are able to do what heavy tanks can do while being cheaper, easier to maintain, faster, and lighter, which obviously makes logistics and support easier on the battlefield. When it comes to mediums and spare parts and fuel supplies and so on and so forth. So how does it translate into the game? I would say that first of all, the 430 is essentially the only other medium tank in the game aside from the Chinese 121 and 120 to also carry a 440 Alpha Strike 122mm gun. So it's got Alpha, and being effectively a heavy tank gun rather than a medium tank gun, it only shoots AP rather than APCR as its standard ammo, and it gives up some shell speed as well as initial penetration for the heavy tank's Alpha Strike. As far as its armor is concerned, I would say the turret for the 430U is very good. Arguably, the turret is about as good as a heavy tank's turret, without any notable weak spots. On practical terms, I would say the turret is essentially 300mm plus effective. So that means, even if you get hit by heat or APCR, fired by Tier 9 and Tier 10 onto your turret, most likely they're not going to pen. Occasionally they will, but not something that the enemy can achieve consistently. Meanwhile, the weak spots on this turret are effectively non-existent, so to speak. They can aim for your hatch, they can aim for your visor, they can aim for your optical devices, but most likely they're just going to knock on the module without achieving any sort of alpha strike whatsoever. As far as the hull is concerned, this tank is really spectacular. I would say that it essentially has an even stronger hull than the previous best in tier E50M. Because E50M has, I believe, 150mm armor bases. This tank has actually 160, and also this tank has a much lower profile and even better angling than the German tank. So one way to look at this tank is, if enemies are trying to engage you in close range, if you know what you're doing, most likely you really don't have that much of a weak spot to offer to them. Meanwhile, if the enemy engage you from a longer distance, they're really going to struggle to penetrate you, even if they spam gold. I would say other things where this tank might in a way balance out the tank's otherwise superiority a little bit. Because, for example, this tank has a lower DPM than the 121 of its own tier. The gun reloads about a half second slower than the 121's 122mm. Even though, considering it's arguably superior penetration as well as better penetrating resistance. It's not that much of a loss. Its mobility is also good, not spectacular. It's in a sense strangely balanced out by being slightly underpowered and by just being so-so when it comes to soft stats. So once again, on good ground, you have no problem hitting 55 km/h. It turns fairly well. Going uphill, you might struggle a little bit because your power to weight ratio. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't have a E50M's 1200 horsepower direct injected gasoline engine. But it's really not that much of a weakness, so to speak.
Enemy armor is hit.
And I would say, in terms of design, this might as well be one of the best medium tanks for side scraping.
We've lost the track.
Because ultimately, this is a tank with a fairly flat and angled and uniform, consistently thick shoulder piece armor along its side hull. So that means when you do side scrape, there won't be that much of a weak spot or that much of a notch. For example, along the turret base, which the enemy can hit, or any armor holes or vulnerabilities, so to speak. And of course, one thing that many people fail to realize about side scraping is the fact that sometimes if you have good mobility, you can quickly engage the enemy in a side scraping position. Meanwhile, if your mobility is kind of inferior, it might take you a while to get into position, thus often missing a chance to engage the enemies. I would say that probably one way to look at this tank also, just as with its own tier 9 counterpart, is the fact that this in a way is also a better variant, or much rather a better executed design that follows very much the same principles as the Chinese medium tanks that have been in the game for a while. That is, you give up APCR, you give up some handling characteristics, but you are still medium. You have pretty good armor, and you have high alpha strike, and you fire AP. Except, this tank in a sense take it to a whole nother level because it's got a much stronger turret as well as a much stronger upper plate than what the 121 has. Just as the case with the 430 versus the 120. So on one side, this tank did exist in real life, and it's good that tanks as well as wargaming are bringing new designs into the game to contribute to further diversity of in-game meta. But at the same time, perhaps they should consider the consequences of escalating the power creep in game. But then once again, this is not all those super heavy, or super high pan, super high alpha, and super high DPM TDs that are very much upsetting the balance of the game on multiple levels. And obviously, I would say that these tanks definitely do best on city maps because choke points and corridors really allows your armor to be useful and allows your armor to shine. Meanwhile, your high alpha strike and the fact that you shoot AP isn't that much of a handicap. You engage the enemies in relatively close range brawls. Meanwhile, your good mobility really allows you to outmaneuver enemy heavies and fight enemy mediums on equal terms. So that's that.
Get going.
Obviously, if I'm showcasing some of the strong tanks the Soviets have, the Anthem's mandatory. It is what it is. But if you look at the numbers I delivered in these tanks fairly early on, in the process of me getting to know these tanks, I think the numbers really speak for themselves. High damage counts, many medals, you're dominating and carrying the games, you're doing everything, and you're doing everything well. That's a lot to ask sometimes. And I would say that over the course of the game's history, many tanks have strived to deliver such a thing, but ultimately, few tanks have really come to this point and be able to do so much. So that's that.